It's part of the Global Studies Pathway Lecture Series. You're our first speaker ever. And the lecture series seeks out academics and field practitioners in the national and international field to share their academic scholarship and experiences. And so we're really happy to have you. And just a little bit about Paulina. Paulina has 16 years involved in advocacy, lobbying, comprehensive policy work, public admin, and the legislative and the regulatory processes. She has secured over $1 million of private grants, no easy feat, and state funding to support her work. Furthermore, she successfully worked with nonprofits, academic institutions, the legislature, and government agencies to advance multiple agendas. She's done advocacy efforts around issues including budget allocations, immigration, environmental justice, government efficiency, transparency, social security, lead poisoning prevention, and early childhood. Truly a Renaissance woman.
Well, thank you.
And so we're happy to hear you talk to us today about your academic scholarship. That's a little bit about your experience.
Okay, well, thank you so much. As you have mentioned, I actually have been in the policy field now for close to 16 years. And during that time frame, I've had the opportunity to work on multiple issues, and I've worked in the policy field through various capacities, and they've included anywhere from advocate to policy director to working with nonprofits, et cetera, working in state government. And throughout that time frame, most of my career has really been focused on, it has been really focused on issues that I personally have a preference for, and that where my heart actually lies. There are many people in this field who can work in programs or in projects or on issues that really don't really care about that much, but I, on the other hand, am not that person. And oftentimes, if I don't really care about an issue, I don't really work on it, and that's that. So as a result, I've oftentimes opted to end up working with a lot of nonprofit organizations who share my values. And throughout that process, I've had the opportunity to engage in many campaigns, engaging in the multiple levels of advocacy that have really begun anywhere from grassroots organizing to, issue-based campaigns. And there are, what I'm essentially going to talk about today, just those multiple phases of the policy process, and some of the things that you have to do when you're working within those parameters, and then just talk about some of the research that has led me into start focusing on. So the first thing is when you're engaging in any sort of advocacy campaign, and whether you're engaging in that advocacy campaign for either a corporation or a nonprofit organization or a small citizens group, the first thing that you have to do is really engage in planning. Planning. There is nothing by happenstance. There is nothing. You have to be aware of every issue that's associated with what you're advocating for. You have to be aware of what all of the various stakeholders are really concerned about. You have to really be clear on how the key policymakers and decision makers view the issue that you're worried about. And you have to understand what the actual implementation obstacles are to that. As part of that process, of course, that means that you have to initiate a media campaign. And depending on the issue that you have or that you're dealing with and the degree of controversy associated with that issue, you can do a couple of things. You could organize press events in which you announce something associated, something that brings light to an issue that you are concerned about. For example, there was a time in which I did devote a large portion of about 5 years that I devoted to early childhood advocacy here in New Jersey. Throughout that time frame, I actually represented an organization which is now defunct, by the way. But during that time, it was thriving. And I represented an organization that essentially was composed of the largest Hispanic organizations in New Jersey, and also housed all of the Spanish bilingual early childhood programs in New Jersey. And so during that time frame, when I initially came on to work on construction issues and helping these organizations actually access construction dollars, which were available at the time. And throughout this process, we ended up finding that the major obstacle to accessing those dollars was really not that they weren't allowed or permitted to access the dollars, but there were obstacles that were being created because there was this misconception that early childhood programs did not have good quality, that were outside of school districts, which ironically enough, back then, there were no school districts offering early childhood programs. And in fact, until then, they were not interested because there were no public dollars that were associated with it. There was no public dollars from the Department of Education at that time. There were only public dollars from the Department of Health and Human Services and a couple of other supplemental programs. So in order to be able to access those dollars, at that moment, what we had to do was we had to begin a public relations campaign for the early childhood programs, for the bilingual ones, and that entailed a variety of things. Number one, we started a brief study and assessed really to assess the quality of the centers. And once we ended up generating our findings, we have the press release and we send out invitations to other individuals. Whenever we would hear of organizations or entities that did not share our philosophical ideas, they would put out reports that said the quality of early childhood programs outside of school districts, which were the primary, again, means of providing early childhood programs, and had an infrastructure for over 20 years of experience in early childhood. Whenever they would put out reports saying, early childhood programs that are outside of school districts have lower quality education than in school districts, we would hold press releases. We would send out press releases to members of the media. We would hold our own press conferences debunking what they were saying. In addition, we would put out our own counter report that would counteract what they were saying, and we would send it to all their funders, and all major state officials saying, we do not agree with any of these. These are things that we do not agree. And we were able to get a lot of press release from a lot of those things. Case in point, the important point being that when you engage in any sort of advocacy initiative, you need to be prepared for, even when you're advocating for a certain position, that there will be someone who's going to come out and get you if you are working against what it is that if you mess with their dollars and their ability to thrive, they will come for you if they're organized. And in fact, there was one particular report in which I actually sat down, read every single one of their references, every single thing, and they misused one of the pieces of data that was meant to be used in a different way. And I put out a big fat press release, and it really undermined the quality of the credibility of their study. And at the end, and they didn't explain how they overcame some of the issues associated with the use of that data. And it turns out at the end they really had a perfectly good explanation for how they overcame what came off as a misperception, as a misuse of data. But at the end it didn't really matter because the perception was they're not credible. So other things that you need to do depending on what it is that you want to engage when you're dealing with the media is really just be aware of who are the reporters that really cover the issue that you're concerned about. When they present a story, you follow up with them and tell them, hey, we have this information, and we notice that you're interested in this. We have this information, and I thought you would benefit from this. You also when you're working with the media, you also take the time out to hold editorial board meetings, and also try to put in editorial of your own. And in those editorial board meetings, you talk about your agenda, and you talk about what it is that you want to achieve, and what position it is that you want them to take. And interestingly enough, when you do that, it does impact how they cover those issues. It impacts how they cover them, and oftentimes, you know, you leave them with something in writing. They will write an article about you, and they literally will cut and paste what you've given to them. It's literally cut and paste, and you know, they'll say one or two things in support of you. When you go to those meetings, make sure you are, again, very well organized. You practice what it is that you're going to say, who's going to say what. If you have a member of the community from where that actually lives where they actually deliver their papers, then that's even better. That is even better because then they can make a story out of that. And also, any sort of precedent that you organize, make sure that you are prepared with some sort of visual that exemplifies the issue that you're worried about. So, for example, going back to the early childhood example that I referred to earlier, there was one time in which the Economic Development Authority at that point had proposed a grant that literally had 175 steps to be able to complete for a construction project, for a facilities project. And without specific dates in which they had to respond to certain things that would really slow down the construction process. We held a press conference. What was the visual? On big boards, we had 175 boards throughout the room that we placed out that served as the visual. If you want to, and they took up the whole entire room, and they, it made a powerful statement. If you want to do a construction project as an early childhood program, this is the steps that you need to take. This is why this is not working. This is why it's not working. Now, given they had, the Economic Development Authority had certain processes in place, had certain things that they were following, protocols that they were adhering to, but that really didn't matter because the visual was, there's 175 placards across this room, and that really said much more than, whatever press release or response they had to say about that. And you always want to send information to reporters and really make them feel like you are a reference. Like when someone or something happens on that issue, this is the organization we have to turn to, because then you increase your visibility. Then many of the legislators and the key decision makers will value your worth based on whether or not they've actually seen you in the papers. And those are like the hot sheets for them, and they read them. And they actually have special services that will, do cutouts for them to see how many articles are covered on particular issues. And I'd add, you should hire and work one of their services so you can keep track of those issues too. Otherwise, it's really very time consuming. I've done it, and it's time consuming. It's important also that when you go out there and engage in any sort of advocacy initiative, that you gather your own data and you present your data. It's important to also know that the way that you present information in an academic setting versus in a policy setting is different. You will use academic information, data, and information, but you are targeting people who literally have less than a minute to look at what you presented. So this big report that you may have spent, 7 months working on, really, 1 page is what they'll read in just a couple of bullets. So what you need to focus on the main points, what's important, what isn't, and what they care about. So again, going back with the early childhood example, once we began going into meetings with a lot of the legislators, one of the important themes that we really identified that we really felt was an obstacle to advancing our agendas on various issues in that field was the fact that many of the legislators essentially felt that our programs were nothing short of babysitting services. And these babysitting services really serve no purpose. So what we ended up doing was, at the time I said, if they saw our are issues associated with school construction and accessing dollars within an economic framework, they would take this more seriously. So as a result, we ended up fundraising to organize and generate an economic impact study. And within any field that you go into, the organization I worked in at the time was really breaking up in a monopoly of thought. And when you're engaging in any sort, and you break up any monopoly, or you interfere with the people who are accustomed to being the traditional stakeholders, you will find a lot of opposition. So whenever you engage in any sort of coalition building around an issue, such as this one of the economic impact study, you have to be willing to do what it takes to make the project move forward, and not just focused on what feels good for yourself. So what we ended up doing was, because the organization I worked at was at heads with many of these other organizations, was we worked through another academic institution, which at the time was Thomas Edison State College, and the Institute for Policy Studies there. And they ended up being the stewards of the project, so that the organization that I was working for did not become the issue, and we were able to carry out the economic impact study. At the end of this, we ended up bringing together over 60 stakeholders that normally didn't work together. We ended up working with all of the 7 departments that worked on early childhood initiatives and after-school programs. And we ended up finding that the early childhood industry and aftercare programs are on par with their economic contributions with the pharmaceutical industry in New Jersey. And we used that to then go on and go to our meetings with legislators. We created a couple of different marketing tools in which we really anticipated, we thought about what is going to be their big ask. And we answered how much is this going to cost, why is this relevant, and what they need to do about it. And so, the point being here, that when you engage in any sort of public relations initiative or any sort of advocacy campaign for an issue that you're concerned about, oftentimes you will run into other issues that have a ripple effect on your main issue of concern, and you will have to look for ways to overcome that. And also, going back to the coalition building, you have to spend time engaging coalition building. Coalition building is really not an easy task. It is not for the meek, it is not for the weak, and if you are made out of butter, this is not the place for you to be. You essentially need to go in, and you need to, also when you're engaging in coalition building, be clear on why it is you're either joining a coalition or forming a coalition. Because when you have various entities and various groups that really care about their own agenda, they're going to push their agenda, and all of the other things that are associated with your agenda, you have to be very mission focused, and you have to be very clear on what it is you want versus what you need. And if you're working in a coalition, you have to focus on what you need. Whatever it is that you want for your organization, your constituency, you do so through your own means. If it's in order for for a coalition to survive, you have to focus on the big picture and not get caught up in many of the shenanigans that go on with coalitions, because they're very political, and they are. But at the end, when you present a united front on an issue with various stakeholders, especially if they're diverse and non-traditional and they don't traditionally work together, your issue will get further, and you will advance that issue. And it doesn't matter where or what, whether you're doing that at the local, state, national, or international level. If you get a diverse group of stakeholders that share an interest that you've negotiated a position on, you will get much further. You will get further, and you're a much stronger force. It's also important to keep in mind that people who have the power to make key policy decisions are very aware that strong coalitions are impactful and can have, and can force the hand of an administration or of a department or change a position, which is why you have to be wary of the fact, you have to be aware of the fact that they will oftentimes try to undermine your coalition. So I have worked on coalitions in which we have come to decisions on what we're going to do together. Then the administration, whom we've been, trying to coerce into our position, has made individual deals with members of the coalition. Thus, the coalition has dissipated, and the impact has been zero. So you have to be aware that when you are engaging in coalition building, you have to really have to keep your eye out on what everyone is doing. Also, coalition building really talks to a very important element of any sort of advocacy initiative that you're going to engage in, which is really relationship building. If you go into any place where there are a lot of lobbyists, or there are a lot of state political appointees, or there's a lot of legislators, you will find that everyone is super nice, super pleasant, super funny, super engaging. You will find, there is a certain personality that is attracted to that field, which, it's that person that nobody likes, that's really annoying, and really is like, you know what I'm talking about. And they're drawn to those positions too. But that's not the majority of individuals. More people are more subtle about it. And most people are super pleasant. And in fact, in the past 5 years, you've seen a large increase in the number of the participation of women who are directing advocacy initiatives and policy initiatives, in part because many of the male legislators want to hear from the females. And that is really, really true. They really do. They're more likely to listen to you unless it is an issue that is male dominated, or you're in an environment where there's only males, which you will find yourself if you're a female in that situation. So when you engage in your relationship building, you always have to make sure you keep certain things clear. Always be honest and credible and reliable. At the moment in which you compromise any of those 3 principles, your credibility as a person that's reliable and anyone would take any risk on actually goes out the window. And you're doomed. You are doomed. Any initiative that you take on will, at that point, from that point on, have a question mark. There's a saying, it takes a lifetime to build a reputation and maybe 1 minute to destroy it, and that really applies. That really, 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 really does apply. And again, also be strategic about the relationships that you build. You want, whether you're going in to meet with a legislator or whether you're going in to meet with another organization, be clear on what it is you want from them. If you are not clear on what you want from them, you are wasting your time and theirs, because you can't tell them how they can be part of what you're doing. You want them to become part of what you're doing, and you want them to adopt your agenda, even if it means compromising a couple of things, but your agenda is what matters. It's nothing else. It's nothing else. And which is also why when you go in to meet with a legislator, oftentimes people, they go in to meet with legislators because it feels like the right thing to do. It just feels right. You're important. It feels like you can do something about it. But legislators are inundated and overwhelmed, and they have so many things to do. When you go in there, you have to make a case that you're credible, and that them wasting 1 minute on you is worth their time. You have to be clear on what it is you want them to do. I want you to hold a committee hearing to investigate A, B, C, and D. I want you to introduce legislation on A, B, C, and D. I want you to oppose this legislation on A, B, C, and D. I want you to support legislation on A, B, C, and D. I want you to work on my behalf to integrate a funding allocation for my organization or for the issue that I'm concerned about. If not, you are wasting their time and yours. And they, and what's worse about it is that if they end up going against the position that you are interested in, if you don't give them those specific deliverables that you want, what you end up finding is that they can say, well, I met with them, and they never said this to me. This is news. And they're right. And they're totally right. And they're totally right. And you also, working with legislators, a lot of legislators will say, this is a really important issue for me. I really care. I really, really do. We'll do our best to do something about it. And month goes by, 2 months, and wait, it's been 365 days and nothing has happened. And that happens to a lot of organizations because they don't get commitments. And when you go in and meet with a legislator, you have to be super clear on these are our objectives. This is our time frame of before we intensify our efforts. Who is the person that we'll work with to make this issue happen? Please give me the name and contact information, and I will work with this person. Because that legislator is not going to be the person working on that issue. So when you engage in advocacy, whether it's in the legislature, and I'll also add as well as in the bureaucratic institutions that actually engage in the implementation of whatever initiative or regulate whatever initiative you're concerned about, you have to woo the staffers, because they're the ones that are going to influence them. And I'll add one more point to that, is that if their staffers are not on board, even if the legislator is, they will find a way to not make that a priority and point to other priorities. So you have to woo them, love them, be sweet to them, be helpful, give them information, make their job easy with the data that you want them to use to make the case that you want. You have to spoon feed them because they're really busy. They're spending a lot of time engaging in fundraising. Sometimes they're engaging in constituent services. They're understaffed. They're young. They're tired. They're on campaigns. You help them. You help them with whatever issue it is that you have. And you help them by giving them information and making less time, less work for them. But you follow up with them. You call them. You send them emails, you give them updates, and if you don't hear from them, say, well, I just wanted to check in on you. Is there anything that I can help you with? Have you heard of anything? Has anything happened since we last spoke? Things of that sort. If you do not do that, that issue will flutter away because they are busy. They are busy. They are busy. And they've got bigger fish to fry. Also, one of the things that you oftentimes will hear a lot of when you go in and meet with a lot of legislators is, it's a really important issue. It's just not the right time. It's just not the right time to talk about this. And I really, care about it. I'm keeping track of this issue. And we'll get to it one day. This is why it's important for you to create your timeline of deliverables in which you are going to step up your advocacy efforts. And those advocacy efforts go from in-person discussions to becoming much more vigilant in the public sphere. You wanna, if this person isn't really willing to come on board, sometimes you have to take the time to say, I would like to put out a press release at the end of our meeting to the public to talk about the outcomes of our meeting. We would like to have you on board with this. And sometimes that can provide quite a bit of pressure. Sometimes they're like, you can do what you want. All right, go for it. But sometimes, they will work with you, have their staffers really try to work with you to form it and put out a press release together. That's really an ideal situation on any issue that you're concerned about. Also, if you really want them to introduce legislation or amend legislation, you should go in prepared with a document of the language you want to see, the language you would like to see in that bill, or that statute that you want amended, or something that's been introduced. Go in with the language. Do it, because literally what will happen is a good percentage of the time, cut, paste, send to legislative services, and they review it. And then you have to follow up and ask them, okay, who in legislative services is working on this, and we would like to work with them. Cut, paste. I mean, literally, it's literally cut and paste. Literally cut and paste. Also, if there's going to be hearing, a hearing of on an issue that you are concerned about, go in with a list of questions that you want them to ask. And they literally will read those questions out. They will literally read them. They literally read. Whenever you see a person that gets a lot of questions that are favorable on their behalf, that point to the issue that they care about, you bet your bottom dollar that they've coordinated that before. And in fact, especially if it's a long hearing or something that's a very visible hearing, try to take the time to coordinate with the person who is organizing the schedule to go closer to the beginning, which will be around 10. For a variety of reasons. Number one, you set the tone. Number two, the media will be there because they're only there for a small amount of time, 10 to 11, and that's it. Then they've got to produce. Then also there's fatigue. There's fatigue, especially if it's a really long one where it's like 3 or 4 hours. There's fatigue towards the end, and towards the end, everyone's like, I can't take it anymore. And although you go on the record, it's not as effective. But go prepared with those questions. Go prepared with what you want to be the outcome. And again, a lot of this really involves a lot of focus on what it is that you want to achieve, because it's very easy to get deviated and distracted by the charms and fancy wordsmithing of other advocates and other lobbyists and other people who are taking on a different position than yours. They all make sense. They're all personable, and they all frame it in a way in which you're like, wow, I do care. I see what you're saying. Man, I never thought of it that way. Which is why you need to be clear on why it is that you are doing what you're doing, and what it is that you want the outcome to be. If you're not clear, you will get lost in the shuffle, because there are many other people who are super sharp, super clear, and super pleasant that are going to thwart your initiative and even throw you offhand if you're not careful. It's also, especially if you are dealing with an issue, before you go in to meet with any sort of legislator, you always should do some investigative work beforehand. You should look at all the bills that they voted on. What are they likely to vote on? Yes. What are they likely to vote on? No. I will note, if you actually check, then most people in the legislature in New Jersey in particular, they have a bunch of yes men. If a bill gets posted and to vote on, for the most part, there are a few that don't pass. They're yes men. They're like, yes, unless it's something really controversial, like, gay marriage or something. But, which incidentally, there was one time which we had organized a press event. They announced that they were doing gay marriage. They were talking about gay marriage at the same time as the hearing on gay marriage at the same time as we were doing our press conference. One reporter came. I'd like to point out, one reporter. But if that ever happens to you, I'll add, you do take actually go back and call the other organizations that didn't go, the other reporters that didn't go. And they, you know, when that happened to us, that we did have a couple of stories that did come out because we went and we sent them a press release, this is what happened. Please write an article. And they do, and literally cut, paste from your press release. But anyway, not to get deviated. So make sure also that you keep track on the issue because you want to know how this person has voted, what they've done, what they haven't done. And the reason you want to do that is, what time is this over? 5 o'clock? Okay, so I'm gonna.
4:45.
Yeah. 15 minutes. Okay. So the reason you really want to do that is just to make sure that you know whether to anticipate what are going to be some of their issues, some of their questions, and what are going to be some of their concerns, and you want to be prepared with an answer for those. You do a lot of research, you do a lot of investigative work, look up any articles, look up any press releases, look up anything that you can to find out beforehand if you've never met with them before, if you don't have an existing relationship. And also, keep in mind that the policy process does not end. It does not end once the statute, you know, it is promulgated. Then you go into the regulatory process in the same type of advocacy that you engage in the legislature, you engage in that same type of advocacy in the regulatory process. Because in the regulatory process, they craft the implementation architecture and the delivery mechanisms for that particular policy. And in there, if you're with an administration that opposes that statute that has been promulgated, they will incorporate obstacles to thwart the implementation of the policy objectives set forth in statute. If it's an administration that supports if it's an administration that actually supports the policy objectives set forth in statute, they will incorporate and facilitate the means for effective implementation. Also, I would add that whenever you see sometimes legislators will promulgate a bill on a particular issue that's favorable to what it is that you're concerned about, but they don't allocate the appropriate dollars to be able to implement that. They don't allocate enough. And when they don't, you will see that they are much looser in their expectations of what is going to be delivered. And ultimately, at times, this ends up compromising whether or not this initiative will be a success or a failure. Because at the end of it, when they do their evaluation on how public dollars are being utilized, they will see, wow, we did this in your favor. Look what's happened. It's not really working out, is it? It's a shame. It's not working out. We're going to have to cut it from the budget. We're going to have to amend this legislation. We're going to have to abridge it. And at some point, if it doesn't have enough funding and the terms are too broad, and there is no commitment or there are too many departments that are involved, or there is no clarity on who is the ultimate authority, you might as well have done nothing. You might as well have done nothing. And those issues also do transcend into the regulatory process. In the regulatory process, you have to be vigilant on a variety of things because those mechanisms for implementation will be what determine the long-term sustainability of the issue that you're advocating for. And though you have to make sure that the definitions that existed in the statute, in the regulatory process, continue to be in the same realm and that they do not constrain the definition or diminish or circumvent the definitions set forth in statute, because if they do, then you will not be able to carry out your initiative. Going back to the early childhood example, in the statute, they had allowed for funding for the expansion or the building of new facilities for early childhood programs through these public institutions. through by public institution, I mean nonprofit organizations specifically. They were not, and during the this happened during the Whitman administration. Then during the McGreevey administration, they were philosophically opposed to the early childhood programs receiving any public dollars to be publicly funded, because they felt that those dollars should go to schools. So what do? That definition of building new facility, they altered to say that the building of a new facility was limited to restructuring within the interior of an existing facility, and it did not permit for them to add space to an existing facility, and it had to be an existing facility, not a new facility. That within itself really constrained what you were able to access and what you were not. In addition to that, you also want to make sure that there is some sort of enforcement mechanism that is strengthened. And you also want to make sure that if they do allocate grants, that you really ask for them to allocate grants in a format that's favorable to you. There's different types of grants that government gives. The one, I'll just focus, because there's not that much time, I'll just focus on the one that you should avoid. The reimbursement for work, or for the work that you've engaged in. There is a movement to obviously for many years now, part of the government has been subcontracting social service providers that are mostly nonprofit organizations to deliver social services. There's been a movement to have many social service providers actually receive, based on their funding retroactively after they've provided the service, and to receive those dollars once they've actually completed the work. This is the worst type of grant that you can receive for a variety of reasons. There are multiple OMB circulars and state circulars that indicate that as well as generally accepted accounting principles that dictate how you are supposed to organize your budgets. You are not supposed to take money from other funding sources to cover the costs of another program. And when you do that, you will be audited. Well, you're audited anyway. Any nonprofit organization is audited, and at the end of that audit, you will have a bad audit. That's a significant finding in your audit. Especially if you run deficits, which many times with these types of grants, the government is the grantor actually takes a sweet little time to give you your money back. Because they don't tell you, we'll give you your money within 30 days. They just say, we'll give you your money. Hello? Where's my money? Where's my money? In fact, I know of one organization that has several contracts that are like that. In the past 2 weeks, they haven't paid their employees. Other organizations have to take out loans to be able to pay their employees. When you do that, that compromises the credibility of your nonprofit organization. Nonprofit organizations must make public their audits. When you solicit other sources of funding, you have to present your audit. If your audit indicates that your organization ran deficits or used funding from other sources to be able to cover the cost of another program, your possibilities for accessing further dollars or tapping into or getting new funders diminishes. And it's even more problematic because many funding sources often now are beginning to develop limitations of 3 years in which they will fund a particular initiative. So, and oftentimes, I will tell you that's one of the strategies that many bureaucratic institutions will utilize to eliminate initiatives or organizations that they're not interested in working with. I mean, they do that. And, a lot of people, I know people in the state government really are underestimated, but they are clever people. They are smart and they are sharp and they are able to navigate extremely difficult situations that, frankly, the private sector would not be able to withstand. And, and they come up with many creative situations because unlike in the private sector, they're still able to make these institutions work with budgets that change mid-year, changing priorities that they don't have control over, with the legislator dictating their agendas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, seeing that we have 4 minutes left, I will then move on to some of the research that I've been working on. And I will add, I guess it's important for you also, I will add, the last statement on the regulatory process is, be involved in the period in which they act before a proposed regulation becomes public, because by the time you do become involved, but if you only become involved once it becomes public, the key policy decisions have been made. They have been. You're fighting an uphill battle. At that point, they've already made the determinations. They will only pay attention if they see a massive influx of complaints on the same issue. And even then, they don't have to answer to that, because they don't have to make alterations based on the number of complaints that they receive. They have to make their alterations based on the record and what they think is appropriate. And in fact, they will only react if they anticipate that they're going to be sued. If they feel like the issues have legal merit and sufficient to be sued, they'll make a change. But if they don't smell a lawsuit, guess what? Just because it's the right thing to do doesn't mean they're going to do it. So, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they perceive what you think is the right thing to do as the right thing to do. Because oftentimes they really are acting on good faith. They really believe that's the right thing to do, even if you totally disagree with it. And admonish them for it, for personally and not publicly. But, so as a result of this, one of the things that I've noticed in this throughout these years is that oftentimes you end up finding that really everyone really does actually know what the policy solutions are. In fact, there's no short mystery. There are so many people who know what needs to be done, but oftentimes what policy brokers end up doing is they opt instead to institute inferior solutions that are transitory, that only last from one administration to the other, and they do so simply because they don't want to navigate the legislative process. If they ask for additional funding from the legislature, their entire initiative could be called into question, and if not eliminated. If they go through the regulatory process, they oftentimes end up going through the same challenges. If people have to choose between the legislative process and the regulatory process, they will choose the regulatory process, because it's easier to kill a bill than to pass it. It really is. And so many things are beyond your control when you go through the legislative process. You have more things in control in the regulatory process, but not as many as you think. So one of the things that I've been working on now, in terms of research that I've been working on recently, is really just how to better coordinate policy objectives and make sure that the corresponding infrastructure that's selected for implementation actually I'll say this quickly because we have 1 minute, allows for the successful policy intervention. So that's really what I've been working on. There's not really that much time to talk about it, but eventually I would like to work towards creating a sort of a matrix that legislators would be able to use of what elements and characteristics to integrate in the statutory process to be able to help them, to better orchestrate and engage in better planning to ensure the success of their policy objectives that they set forth in statute. So,
does anyone mind if I would like to hear a little bit more about it? With an extra 10 minutes being.
We have room till 45.
Till 40. Okay. Well, see, essentially what I've started doing is actually, I actually believe that there happen to be certain universal principles that exist in what constitutes good governance, and I don't mean good governance in the traditional sense. I mean good governance in terms of what is effective, in terms of efficacy. And so essentially I've actually started looking at various initiatives in which I'm looking at certain measures. And those measures really are how broad is the language, how much support or opposition is, how prescriptive is the language. Is it overly broad or, is it overly broad or overly prescriptive? Other measures that I've started looking at include the scope of work that is proposed. Is there consistency or a similarity between the definitions in the legislative process versus in the statutory, in the regulatory process? Are there major changes? The adequacy of the funding sources, as well as the types of mechanisms that are being selected. So are they doing, when is it more effective for there to be for the enforcement mechanism to be through funding? So if you don't do A, B, C, and D, we take your funding away. Or is it really just through the regulatory process actually having inspectors come out and say, okay, this is working, this is not? Is it better to utilize certain types of audits? How frequently should those audits be conducted? And what should they really be looking for? And not just in terms of financial management, but also in terms of service delivery, outcome delivery. What are some instances in which there should be red flags that indicate there should be a readjustment in how there's an implementation in the program? Also, the impact of organizational limitations, I think, also is significant when you're really looking at whether or not whether an initiative is going to be successful, and whether or not you can actually successfully or could carry out those objectives set forth in statute. And also, what role does the public perception play in that particular issue? There are certain types of regulations that have greater sustainability than others. And so, for example, regulations that deal with internal procedural matters, that how they archive information, how they maintain their information, or how they communicate to the public. Those types of regulations usually are not challenged. They're really not. They're not for a particular reason that is almost invisible. Nobody really cares. Nobody. How do they generate their they have protocols that they have to adhere to for how they actually structure their budgets, and those protocols are usually not called into question. Why? Because they're mostly invisible. By the public. Whereas if you institute regulations, or you introduce public policy statute that deals with, let's say, welfare, you are going to have a massive influx of complaints. You will encounter obstacles. You will encounter a variety of things that you won't that you're not going to encounter if you're dealing with something that's more internal, and they really are sustainable, especially when it comes to, particularly when it comes to issues that really involve accounting, or how they manage some of their internal taxation, how they calculate their costs. They do have parameters on how they have to do that, but it doesn't really get scrutinized in the way that you think it should be. But yet, if you introduce regulations on issues such as, let's say, how social workers should interact with families, you are going to have a large influx of people who are commenting. And many of your initiatives could be called into question depending on how you integrate the parameters of how they communicate with families. If you have after school programs, for example, and you change the number of adults that are going to be interacting with the kids, less adults, you will get a large influx of people who are commenting on it. Whereas if you change the number of people in an office internally, that's an invisible issue and it never really gets addressed. So for now, it seems as if, I'm still gathering data and information, so all of this is very preliminary, but factors that really do seem to impact, is whether or not they're going to be public, they're going to be, the issue is actually, in addition to public, is that, do they have adequate measurement tools and what do those measurement tools look like, as well as the use of the language. Those three elements seem to really influence whether or not it's going to be something that's sustainable or not, and whether or not it's going to be vulnerable to lawsuits. So. Any other questions? Or
can you tell us a little bit more about the matrix that you're creating, and what, how are you going about, getting your data, and where are you? Because they're looking at it. You can look at audits. Audits are actually very good for this type of information. But I guess how are you picking and choosing?
Well, there's a variety of tools that I'm actually looking at, and in government you use multiple tools. You use direct government. You use grants. You also use. I'm not looking as much as these. I'm really the tools that I'm actually focusing on are really government, direct government, as well as grants, because they're just easier to quantify. Because if not, but the other tools that you actually use are you also use sometimes individuals use loans, special loan initiatives, regulations, specifically regulation, the number of people that are assigned to going in and actually regulating. Regulating. No, you're not meeting these standards. Yes, you are meeting those standards. And other tools that are used by government. Also, it's not as much grant, but procurement, which is kind of a bit of a different category. So the two tools that I'm actually focusing on are those, because if A, resources and money, and B, I think really it's just resources and money. So those are the ones that I'm starting off with, and mostly I'm looking at social service programs at this point. But eventually, I'm going to look at social service, taxation, as well as education issues, as well as some environmental issues. Because in the environment, environmental regulations really are where there's a lot to be looked at in terms of things that should be incorporated that are not. For example, you have to comply with this by certain dates. These are the deliverables that you must have, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things that are not incorporated into environmental regulations simply because the environmental institutions, the EPA, et cetera, they don't have the recent manpower. In addition, OSHA is there are so many regulations that oftentimes when you have too many regulations, it's almost like they become impotent because it's just so much. It's just so much. So.
It's very interesting. And so in terms of, we talked a little bit about, what would you hope to do? What would you hope to do with this?
Matrix. Well, essentially, what I would hope to do is work with legislators to say, okay, in the legislative process, these are some of the things that you need to think about. You are currently working on initiatives that deal with youth and gang violence, for example. These are some of the parameters that you need to integrate into your statute. You are currently dealing with after-school programs, for example. take into consideration when you are planning in the legislative process, so that they can be transcended into the regulatory process. And in part, I think it's important to do that because many legislators, honestly, they just don't have the time. I mean, literally thousands of pieces of legislation are introduced on a consistent basis. And although many of them, especially if they're seasoned, have an instinct about what is a good statute, they don't keep track of every statute that they're working on. They don't. They just don't have the manpower to do it. Even their staffers don't have the manpower to do it. And their staffers, who are the primary individuals who really work on those things, they're transient and they keep changing. They keep changing and changing. And you don't see people there for more than 2 years. 2 years, 3 years at the most, unless there's a personal relationship that is established there. In which case you will find some people where they're like 15, 20 years, but it's because they're actually friends. They're actually friends. It's not just, it's not just, oh, okay, well, I'm doing my job. They're really like friends. So, it's really very, I think one of the biggest obstacle really at this point, I think, for many legislators is really, they have a series of policy objectives that they wanna carry out, but they don't have the money to do that. And there's such scrutiny that every single issue is becoming scrutinized. It's also easier to get, I've had information on many of housing and social service, issues, because now there's a large movement in government towards really tracking data and tracking what programs work and what programs don't. And so they actually have modules and models that they have where that their grant recipients actually have to utilize, and they actually tell them how many people are serviced, how much time is needed, and how much it actually costs. They actually track those issues. So accessing that information is easier because they actually collect it.
Is it consistent?
It's consistent from the great challenge that really lies is it's consistent within a department, but it's not from department to department. So really you can only I'm only really engaging in case studies and really focusing on themes, because it's really you can't do it because they collect different information. Even the same information is collected differently from department to department. And oftentimes, they don't even realize that they're collecting the same information. And they do so for different purposes. So even though they work on similar initiatives, it's really not the same at all. And they view the same issue from a different perspective. So, really, these are really more like case studies that are being done. And from that, I'm looking at the universalities that are really rising. And really, they seem to be, again, around the issue of funding. They seem to be around the issue of how broad is the language, what mechanisms are really being integrated, and how are the measuring outcomes really being looked at, and what are their audits finding. And those are really, it's really surprising how consistent it seems to be across these fields. It's surprising, and I think it's with time, some of these principles would be able to be applied to other fields, because there are also other those universalities of good government that I've been talking about, again within the context of efficacy. Really, I think really just if you look, I've actually been doing historical accounts lately on a variety of long-lasting government systems that have lasted literally for centuries, and there are certain consistencies certain themes that seem to come up that consistently during times of growth for those different entities, and they are number one, they have effective bureaucratic institutions. Number two, they have highly specialized and trained bureaucrats that actually are in place in transition from one government system to another. Number three, they have not only do they have existing and functioning bureaucracies, but they generally tend to focus on the following issues: commerce, trade, taxation, public works, urban planning, and standardization. And standardization of laws, standardization of things like currency, standardization of things like language. And one of the big elements of any piece of regulation is that it focuses on standardization. And it's standardization so that you can have an equal application of the law. And that equal application of the law is what, in many instances, grants it the legitimacy it needs to be able to be successful in the long run. Because when people perceive that a particular piece of regulation or government initiative is biased or up to the interpretation of the person who is actually engaging in the service delivery, the legitimacy is called into question altogether. And I do believe that there are certain universalities that do exist when it comes to regulations, and it really, again, standardization, and that it actually works. It actually works. If it doesn't, it's doomed. It's doomed, or it becomes invisible and doesn't make a difference even if it does exist.
And can you tell us some of the countries where this is actually?
Well, I've been looking at the Roman Empire. I've been looking at the Ottoman Empire. I have been looking at the Egyptian Empire, as well as, and these are as well as a couple of the African empires, and the Spanish Empire. And I chose them for a particular reason. And the reason was because they were long lasting. They're not, and they're separated from those. They're separated from the quote unquote democratic principle, and what you ultimately find is that these universal themes come up, and those universal themes are still applicable today. They're still applicable today. None of them are not applicable today. None of them are not in place today, and they are so in institutions that are democracy-based and not democracy-based. Because there are dictatorships that exist that work, that have been around. And the same seems to be the case for those same features also come up for transitioning governments. There are many governments that have transitioned from dictatorships into democracies, what we consider democracies, or some sort of pluralistic government today, and they have done so effectively. And why? Had bureaucratic institutions that work. They have bureaucratic institutions that work. There's been standardization. Those bureaucratic institutions address taxation. They address commerce. They land and resource management. They address urban planning. They standardization, and they have highly specialized in bureaucrats, as well as individuals who transition from one kind of government to another. Also, the other element I forgot to mention is they engage in some form of coalition building. Even if they, people were reticent, they had something to gain from it. So, it's another. And those things still apply today. They still apply in the regulatory process. In the regulatory process, if you don't engage in effective coalition building and you don't bring individualism in, you will be sued. Unless it is an issue that's invisible to the public. If it is an issue that's invisible to the public, such as tax, such as internal accounting matters, nobody will notice. Nobody will notice, as well as making any changes or updates will also be invisible. Whereas when you affect people's ability to do well or to have needs that they do not have the ability to control by themselves met, when you compromise that, you're one step away from rebellion. Huh?
Revolution.
Yes, revolution. Whether it's people storming the welfare office or people storming the Bastille. So, I mean, and, you know, it's, people underestimate the impact of the regulatory process. In part, it's so cumbersome. And you really, really, really have to be specialized and pay a lot of attention, because you have to not only be cognizant of your legal mandates, but you also have to be cognizant of how it's actually going to work. And you have to have two levels of specialization. And those levels of specialization involve understanding the system, actually 3 levels: understanding the system, understanding the bureaucracy and how it functions, and understanding the needs of the constituency you're going to serve. And what will happen. What will happen. And as a result, you will also see in the regulatory process that there's also a great dichotomy between those who are political appointees and those who are civil servants. Those civil servants, you know, you should not underestimate them, because they'll be there after forever and ever. For century upon century upon century.
Yeah, bureaucrats are bureaucrats.
Yeah, and they're there. And they're there. And they cannot last you. There's a reason why when Obama has indicated that he does not want many of the immigration officials to engage in police work, there's a reason they're like, we don't care, because we'll be here when you'll be gone. And the consequences are really minimal. You know, if you don't have your civil servants on board, you're halfway doomed. You know, and you know, I've also worked on a variety of different types of, you know, issues. And then again, the systematic issues that really do come up when you see them, there's these universal themes. Language is, if it's overly prescriptive, it is, or overly broad, it will have no impact. If the appropriate mechanisms aren't linked together, you don't utilize the proper, let's say, focusing on grants, if you don't use the appropriate grant, it's not going to work. If you don't have a proper way of measuring what it is you're doing, it's not going to work. And even though this is not what I'm looking at, this is true. What you select as your measuring mechanism defines your issue. Based on that is what exists and what does not exist. And in government, even if everybody knows something is an issue, if it's not on paper, it's not an issue. Which is why there's so many issues that arise when it comes to data collection and how it's collected, because it's not on paper. It just doesn't exist. And that's why you see so many what people consider stupid studies that are conducted to prove things that we all know instinctively and have common sense. It's not on paper. It's not real.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you so